All right, welcome back. It's time for everybody's favorite portion, the debate. So the resolve for today is...
Yeah, so once more, we're representing two sides of this resolution, not necessarily our personal views. It's for the education of the viewer. We're sacrificing the ego where you can quote us out of context for education purposes.
Yeah.
So again, not our particular views. The resolution reads, resolved, the movement for Black Lives ought to accept support from the American Church. I'll be representing the affirmative, and as the affirmative does in debate, I'll set up the whole thing to make it very clear. So when we say ought, we're talking about we have a moral obligation. This is going to be fundamental to the round in understanding why we would do this, right? It's the right thing to do. Then when I talk about the American Church, I mean black, white, whatever, right? Christians who have been in social movements before, looking at Jesus, right? And that tradition, there's a lot of splintering going on, but this includes Catholics, this includes Mormons to a degree, Baptists, whatever. And the movement for Black Lives is all of the effort being done under Black Lives Matter, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, National Urban League, and all of us who are independent out there marching, campus movements, things of that nature, right? It's our movement in 2020 is not one where you can be like the Black Panthers or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? It's the movement for Black Lives. Twitter is very much included. So, getting all that out the way, observation one is that the movement today looks, acts, and gets different results than the movement of not even yesteryear, but of half a century ago. So we look at, the Paragon, Martin Luther King and his movement. The church was crucial, central, and had to that point been central to the advancement of black people because it is an institution that binds us to a moral obligation to do the work, a moral conviction that keeps us right as we do that work. And when the church is not right all the time, it's far from right all the time, but in that work, often, righteous, and then gets a lot of money because it's hard in America, though, a government loyal to no particular religion, we are a people that are particularly loyal to the Christian religion. And so the first black colleges were started in basements, in the backs of churches, with the money available to Methodists and to Lutherans and to Baptists, right? And so the church was always crucial. Now that we've got that clear for the background, when we jump to the current day, and we see that since King, and since the King of Peace is dead, in the words of Nina Simone and others, since that man who represented so many Christian ideals was murdered by a so-called Christian nation, we've strayed away from that because we've seen it being quote-unquote less effective and weak. We've seen it as problematic in a number of ways. But when we look at our results today, are they better? Right? Are we, as a result of divorcing Black Lives Matter from the church and its efforts, are we more effective in pushing legislation? Are we more effective in organizing, in fundraising, in actually getting whatever particular results that we want? Secondly, not only is there the effectiveness issue, but there's the splintering of the community. As I said before, the church, or any religious institution, like if you go to the Middle East, there's a different religion, right? If you go to the Far East, there's different religions. So all across the world, faith is just important to people. It's important to culture. And our culture as Black Americans is very tightly tied to the church. All of our great artists come from the church, and that's just a perfect example there. So whether Aretha Franklin or Anderson .Paak, the church is crucial. And so for the older generation, when we cut off the church, you lose them, right? So my cousins, uncles, even my brother-in-law, right? When it comes to liberal policies and liberal elected officials who would advocate for Black lives in one way or another, he's reticent because he's a clergyman and his priorities and loyalties lie with the church first. And when the movement and liberalism cut the church off, they lose him. right? And so we all know these old black people, or particularly religious black people, who are lost when the movement says we are Marxists by nature and therefore oppose the church, or we want to make space for all these people you say are sinful, and so we cut the church off. And lastly, besides the effectiveness, besides splintering the community, it's lost all, or not all of, but a lot of the singular direction, as I put forth in the observation. There's though Christianity, as any religion is splintered among many denominations, there's a focus towards service and humanity. Though many people twist it to do other things, the original purpose, the original teachings and practices are centered along that kind of ideological line. Whereas a Marxism, a humanism, right? All these are foreign to American ears, scary to American eyes, and very poorly understood. Whereas a religion, again, across the world, regardless of whether it's American or not, is not a political or philosophical framework, but rather a spiritual calling that people can very clearly direct and fall in line with and make it a purpose of their entire life. And so when we lose that purpose, that direction, when we lose different parts of the community by cutting them off because they're saying they're old or whatever, and then when we lose our effectiveness in American culture, I believe we've lost too much when we kind of push the church away for a different ideal.
Okay, so my argumentation against it, right? So first, I'll do a little on case to give my argumentation, and then I'll try to hit your case, right?
That's off case, but yeah.
So off case, it's been a minute. It has been.
Yeah, debate's weird. Yeah.
So first, the ought to, right? That we ought to allow the church into the movement, right? The first negative point against that is that the American church includes the white evangelical church, right?
Yes.
And since the days of Nixon and the silent majority, they have been one of the greatest stumbling blocks to black advancement, black people doing better, right? So Nixon created the war on drugs, Reagan perfected it, right? So these people who were supposed to be men of faith, right, many times enacted laws that made our lives much worse, right? Many times the black church sometimes were behind these same people, right? So there was black clergymen who was for Nixon, one of the most corrupt presidents we ever seen. Many times the white church has gotten behind movements that many times harm their communities, right? So in the war on drugs, they're like, we need to clean the streets for these kids, right? Nancy Reagan is supposed to be a spiritual woman, saying that we need to clean the streets up for our kids, right? Many times the church led the movement in turning its back on the LGBTQ community, right? So when the AIDS epidemic really slaughtered our communities in the 80s and 90s, right, it was the white evangelical church that was saying that we shouldn't talk about it. There are sinful people, and therefore what happens to them is because of God, right? It was the black church who fell in line behind that movement and that speaking, and many times it would happen to be the community in itself. The radicals that you speak of, the Marxists, who did these needle drops, who did these testing centers to make sure people got tested, who talked about contraceptive, because the white evangelical church and the black church both taught only abstinence, and then I teach about contraceptive and safe sex, leading only to make the epidemic worse, right? There are many people who are dead now because of their actions, right? So I think as we talk about that we ought to allow the church in, there are sins the church has not atoned for, right? There are sins that the church does not want to address or talk about, right? So if I was to go to a clergyman and bring this up, how often is it they're going to say that they were wrong for what they did? That is the question that I have. Secondly, the movement today envelops people in its communities, right? And the movement in the past are not, right? So there is the queer community very much in our movement today, right? There is those who aren't technically spiritual in our movement today, right? So those who don't feel the need to go to church, right? These people are, by definition, considered to be sinful by the American church, right? Is the American church and being in the Black Lives Matter movement going to be okay with working with these people, right? Are they going to be okay with accepting, not, because they use the term lifestyles, right? But it's not lifestyles, it's who they are. It's who they are to their core. They're going to be okay with accepting who they are, right? If they're not, then we ought not to accept the help of the American church, right? The charitable donations, the fact that the effectiveness is a problem, right? I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is very young, right? So it started really in 2013. We're only 7 years in. The church has been around for generations, millenniums, right? It's been 2,000 years since Christ died, right? It's been a long time the church has been perfecting this, right?
Yeah.
At one point, the Holy Roman Empire controlled the world, right? So the church has been a mechanism to be effective for a long time. Black Lives Matter is only 7 years old. So I think its effectiveness has yet to be seen. We're still working out the kinks. We're still figuring out how to do it correctly. But I think at the core of the issue, the principle of the matter, I think is the Black Lives, the movement of Black Lives, should I accept the American church unless the American church is going to be accepting of who these people are in their community. If they're going to be loving towards them, show actual Christian love towards them. If they're going to turn their backs on these policies that harm our communities, then we can accept them. But if not, then we cannot accept them, and we must do the movement on our own because they are a relic of the past.
Okay, I'm gonna keep it brief.
Yeah.
As we wrap things up, I'm gonna give a little bit of rebuttal, and I'm gonna try to drive it home with a bit of a metaphor that I learned in my travels. But first things first, let's not confuse the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. It really got on me. One is far worse than the other. The Roman Empire, fantastic, not Christian at all. They killed Jesus. Yeah. And the Holy Roman Empire is a fake facsimile of what happened in the past. They're trying to, do some fascism and bring it back to the former glory. Anyway, when we talk about the sins of the church, black or white, when it comes to being sex negative, in short words, when it comes to just causing mass harm, whether it's AIDS or conversion therapy or whatever, like done bad stuff.
Right.
That doesn't make them ineligible for doing good things and have been doing good things all the while, because as I stated from the very onset, black schools, when we're talking about Morehouse and Spelman, Paul Quinn College, many of our HBCUs are private institutions funded in large part by the church. Wiley College, home of the great debaters, is a Methodist school. And the church is the Catholic Church in particular, one that is full of sin, right? When it comes to doing wrong to people, it's the largest charitable organization on the planet. And so I'll give a metaphor to kind of drive this home, because all those sins are real. I'll tell a historical story. There's a gentleman named Bayard Rustin who was a key player in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. He worked very closely with Dr. King, a preacher from the South who, when it comes to sex, I don't even remember hearing anything, but I doubt his views, strayed very far from mainstream. Another gay gentleman who's excellent and prophetic and powerful and potent and accepted by all in the movement, though very much so in the closet, or at least in secret, not publicly known as gay, is James Baldwin, right? So the namesake of our show is a gay gentleman, and we of course don't want them to sideline their identity, right? But to use a metaphor that I learned while in China, there's a symbol of the snake that rides the tortoise's back, right? And so there's a turtle who can move through the water, who has protection on his back, and can go where the snake cannot go. The snake says, I'll hold off on biting you and killing you, right, to get to the other side. And the turtle says, well, I have protection on my back now that the snake rolls with me. Regardless of how the metaphor shakes out, whether you're the snake or the turtle, it's beneficial for both, because the church needs to embrace social justice in order to survive going forward, because people kind of hate you because of what you've done. Yeah. It is what it is, right? We both, to survive, must embrace each other to cross the river in peace. whether that love is there, that Christian love that's gonna love people past whatever sin you perceive, is an absolute necessity. But refusing to sideline the church and refusing to forgive, or continuing to sideline and refusing to forgive the church of its sins, is going to prevent the movement from accessing all of this money, all of this clout, all of this influence. I mean, simply just acknowledging the church, Black Lives Matter does not, would gain so many black and white pastors, and where they stand hardline on abortion, which is the protection of life as their argument, where they stand hardline or stood hardline on gay marriage, they could stay in hardline on Black lives if Black lives would say, hey, as Frederick Douglass did, as Martin Luther King did, as so many Christian leaders that have been historically for Black lives have done to great effect. The church, that rhetoric, can take power from those who have always had it, white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon men, and give it to those who may be gay, trans, black, women, and are on the opposite end of the spectrum. But that cross, that symbol, can transfer all of that power if yielded correctly.
Yeah. So I think, in closing, I think for me personally, so let's get to like my personal opinion on this.
No longer an advocate for the negative.
Growing up,
it's water.
Growing up, as someone who was being groomed to preach, right?
Yes. I was like, wait, what? Where's it going?
Groomed to preach, though. I think many times the message of Jesus, and the message of salvation and forgiveness,
yes,
and the meek shall inherit the earth, right? I think is convoluted and mixed up and turned sideways to the ends of power.
Absolutely.
To retain comfortable living. Being a Christian should never be comfortable.
Right.
And that means that if I, as a white cis male or as a black cis male, if that means I must be uncomfortable to make sure my brother or sister feels comfortable, then I must do that. Feels safe. Then I must do that, right?
and that really presents a nice little trade-off. That the white church has to sacrifice comfortability for the safety of many others. Yeah.
And to finish it off, James says beautifully, right?
Scripture.
The scripture. When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was hungry, did you feed me?
Or when the police were killing me, did you tell them to stop?
Yeah, because you cannot deal with the spiritual if the physical is at harm. And so therefore, we want to talk about the spiritual aspect of these other communities, but what about the physical?
Yeah.
A black trans woman's life expectancy is 35 years old. I don't understand. You can talk about that some other time, but first, let's make sure they can live past the age of 35.
Abysmal.
So I think that really is what it breaks down to. And if you're not going to listen, if you're not going to hear these words and start to think about it, you're not practicing Jesus. And I'll say that straight up. You're not practicing the words of Jesus Christ.
So let us know what you think. Hit us in the comments, reply, share. Should the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives, accept the support, financial and otherwise, of the American church?
So this is Relatively Conscious, Antonius Brown,
Irvin Bryant.
We'll see y'all next week.